History likes clear pyramids of power. A king at the top, soldiers below him, farmers at the bottom. Authority flows downward, taxes flow upward. The state controls everything. But in early medieval India, that pyramid tilted because in many regions, temples became more powerful than kings. Not always louder, not always richer in spectacle, but often more stable, more rooted, more economically influential. And power, in the end, belongs to whoever controls resources, labor, and loyalty. Between roughly the 7th and 13th centuries, the political landscape of the subcontinent fragmented. Large empires gave way to regional kingdoms. Dynasties rose and fell with striking frequency. Borders shifted. Capitals moved. Armies marched. But temples remained. At first glance, temples appear purely religious, places of worship, stone carved into devotion, ritual performed before sacred images. But early medieval temples were not only spiritual centers, they were economic engines. Kings granted land to temples, sometimes entire villages, sometimes tax-free estates. These grants were recorded carefully on copper plates and stone inscriptions. They listed boundaries, water sources, trees, fields. What the king gave was not symbolic, it was productive land. And land is revenue. When a temple received land, it gained the right to collect taxes from that land. It could supervise cultivation. It could organize irrigation. It could employ laborers. Over time, these land grants accumulated. One grant became 10. 10 became 50. Villages became networks. Temples did not merely own land, they managed it. They hired accountants. They kept records. They regulated wages. They coordinated agricultural cycles. In some regions, temples became the largest landholders. And when you are the largest landholder, you are the largest economic authority. Kings depended on military force. Temples depended on continuity. A king's rule might last decades. A temple's presence could last centuries. Political instability often increased temple influence. When central authority weakened, local institutions filled the gap. Temples provided structure, predictability, administrative memory. They stored grain. They distributed food during scarcity. They funded irrigation repairs. Economic trust shifted toward them. Temples also functioned as employers. Priests, musicians, dancers, scribes, guards, craftsmen. A major temple could support hundreds of individuals directly. Indirectly, it sustained thousands. Festivals stimulated markets. Pilgrimage attracted merchants. Trade routes adjusted to sacred geography. Devotion created demand, and demand creates revenue. Donations flowed constantly, not just from kings, from merchants, from guilds, from ordinary worshippers. These donations were strategic. Merchants donated to gain legitimacy. Guilds donated to secure blessings for trade. Rulers donated to demonstrate piety and authority. The temple became a bank of reputation. To be associated with it enhanced status. Over time, temple treasuries filled with gold, jewels, livestock, and grain. Unlike royal courts, temples did not need to spend heavily on war. They accumulated. Accumulation creates leverage. Temples could lend. They could invest in irrigation tanks. They could finance new settlements. In South India, especially under dynasties like the Chola dynasty, temple institutions expanded dramatically. Monumental temples were built not only as spiritual statements, but as economic hubs. Inscriptions from this period show meticulous accounting. Loans were issued with interest. Endowments funded perpetual lamps. Land was measured precisely. This was financial management. Kings patronized temples to legitimize their rule, but in doing so, they strengthened institutions that could outlast them. A king might conquer territory, but the temple administered it. Ritual authority reinforced economic authority. Temples were seen as the homes of deities. Property dedicated to a deity was sacred. Sacred property was difficult to confiscate. Seizing temple land risked moral outrage. This gave temples a layer of protection beyond political negotiation. The deity was the ultimate landowner. The temple staff were stewards. A king could be challenged. A god could not. Temples also functioned as centers of dispute resolution. Villagers brought conflicts to temple assemblies. Records were preserved. Decisions were inscribed publicly. Transparency created trust. When communities trust an institution, they align their loyalty with it. Political rulers needed loyalty to field armies. Temples needed loyalty to sustain economic networks. In many cases, the latter proved more durable. Temple assemblies sometimes managed entire localities. They supervised irrigation tanks. They organized collective labor. They regulated market spaces near temple complexes. The temple courtyard was not empty space. It was civic space. Education was often linked to temples. Scholars were supported. Texts were copied. Philosophical debates were hosted. Knowledge added prestige. Prestige attracts patronage. Temple architecture itself signaled permanence. Massive stone structures conveyed stability. Granite does not retreat like armies do. When villagers saw a towering temple gopuram, they saw continuity. Continuity inspires confidence. Kings needed temples for ritual validation. Royal coronations required sacred sanction. Victories were commemorated through temple endowments. Rulers embedded themselves within temple networks to project legitimacy. But dependency runs both ways. If a king relied on temple sanction, temples gained bargaining power. They could influence local appointments. They could negotiate terms of grants. In some regions, temple authorities effectively mediated between peasantry and crown. They became intermediaries. Intermediaries shape outcomes. Temple economies also integrated long-distance trade. Merchants donated to temples along trade routes. Temples stored wealth securely. Sacred status deterred theft. Trust in temple custody facilitated commerce. When wealth is stored in a stable institution, economic complexity increases. Thus, temples anchored financial systems. Kings ruled territories. Temples ruled networks. And networks can be stronger than territory, especially when territory changes hands frequently. It is important to not romanticize this power. Temple dominance did not eliminate hierarchy. It did not erase inequality. Control over land meant control over labor. Endowments often depended on peasant production. But in structural terms, temple institutions accumulated a kind of authority that rivaled political sovereignty. They controlled resources. They commanded loyalty. They shaped local governance. When invasions occurred, temples were often targeted precisely because of this wealth and influence. Attackers understood where power truly resided. The prominence of temples reveals something larger about early medieval India. Power was decentralized. It was distributed among kings, feudatories, guilds, and religious institutions. No single node dominated permanently. Temple economies became powerful not because kings were irrelevant, but because kings chose to empower them. Land grants intended to secure divine favor and political loyalty gradually built parallel authorities. Each grant strengthened the temple's independent base. Over generations, this accumulation shifted the balance. What began as patronage evolved into structural influence. Temples became landlords, bankers, employers, arbiters, cultural patrons. And because they operated in the name of eternity, they often outlasted dynasties. So why did temple economies become more powerful than kings in early medieval India? Because land grants multiplied. Because political fragmentation increased local autonomy. Because temples accumulated wealth rather than spending it on war. Because sacred status protected property. Because communities trusted them. Because rulers needed their legitimacy. Power does not always sit on a throne. Sometimes it sits behind a sanctum. Sometimes it is carved in stone and recorded in inscription. In early medieval India, temples were not merely places of worship, they were economic ecosystems. And ecosystems, once established, are hard to dismantle. Kings came and went, but the temple bell kept ringing.